while we were there, we also talked with leaders in the community, including religious leaders, about what else needed to be done to bring about peace in South Sudan. And what I can say is there are a lot of women and men who are willing to organize and to risk, including I was sitting with a minister in WOW, and he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I'm willing to be martyred." And so I quickly said, well, now, there's a lot of other methods besides that, but I think that that is representative of the commitment that we're seeing both within communities around South Sudan and also in the diaspora. So I also went to Bentiu, which is an area that's called a protection of civilian area in the northern part of the country. And there's 112,000 people living in that protection of civilian area. And we have a team of 20 people who are there. I got to meet again with the women's peacekeeping teams, with 3 of them. So again, about 100 women who continue to demonstrate remarkable resilience in terms of the work that they're doing. Among other things, they're accompanying women who are raped, first of all, to get medical attention and then to report the crime to make sure that she doesn't get thrown in jail. They're also working to keep their children from being abducted, and doing a number of other things within the camp. We're told while I was there that there are more rapes taking place within the camp as opposed to outside of the camp. There are people who are coming in the middle of the night, coming over the berm, which even I could do. It's not very hard, and robbing people and then leaving. And so we've talked with the mission about protection strategies. Frankly, the head of the UN mission at that place called Bentiu told me that one of my advocacy points should be 750 kilometers more of razor wire. Now, that's one approach to protection, and it could be helpful, although a lot of that razor wire is ending up in the camps of the opposition who are nearby. And so we talked about community protection strategies and how we could coordinate with the UN, especially the UN police, to do true protection during the night. What we found time and time again is that we need more people. We have 160 people on the ground, and working with staff, we came up with a concept note where we need at least 318 more people who both to reinforce some of the places where we're working and also to cover vulnerable areas where no one is currently at. Again and again, I saw our teams engaging, working across the lines with all kinds of people who are involved in the conflict, doing it with meager resources, and for the most part, keeping their morale up. The space is shrinking for all of civil society right now. The government is making it more difficult for people to move around, for people to work, for people to get into the country. And so last week I met with the special envoy to the Sudans from the United Kingdom, and he had just been in South Sudan the week before, and he said he was blocked at the airport from going any place but Juba. And so they are acting more emboldened. As many of you probably know, a week ago Sunday, there was a driver for the Red Cross, an employee of the Red Cross, who was killed. That brings the number of humanitarian workers who've been killed since December of 2013 to 86. So there are increased security protocols that we're having to employ, like earlier curfews, and yet our teams continue to work in some very remote areas. On the political level, there is a process that is they call it the revitalization process, that's being led by a regional group, which is called IGAD, but it includes Kenya, Uganda, chaired by Ethiopia, Djibouti, Sudan, and people are putting a lot of hope that there can be some kind of revitalized peace accord that can come from that process. I personally don't put a lot of hope in men in a fancy hotel in Addis Ababa. I think that the real hope comes from women, especially women on the ground, who are continuing to work, and also from the clergy, the Council of Churches, that is becoming more and more active in terms of building a base from the bottom for a demand to end the war. And so I think that if you know the story of the situation in Liberia, where women came together and actually in a very profound way brought about peace and a very, very significant change in Liberia, I think that something like that is going to be required, going to be a peace with any kind of justice in South Sudan.
Could you story that illustrates why that you have hope in that approach, to bottom up? Was there what leads you to think that?
A couple of things. First of all, I see the strength in the women's peacekeeping teams, of which there are now 10. We've trained over 1,000 women. The resilience that they have in terms of doing work and wanting to do more. There also now seems to be an increasing cross-tribal unity and people wanting to speak with one voice. I think that the churches are much more involved and wanting to help build that base. And we've, of course, seen churches play major roles in these kinds of efforts in places like El Salvador and the Philippines. And I think that I know that there are numerous examples of people doing this kind of work, of people opting out of war. Several of you on the phone right now know those examples better than I. And so there are lots of different strategies that can start out at a very low level of participation. For example, in Liberia, the women started out by all wearing white on the same day. And when they started to see their strength in numbers, they increased their activities. We're seeing right now in the Philippines, the Catholic churches are ringing the church bells from 5 to 5:05 to protest President Duterte and his death squads. And so there are those activities that can build and certainly are possible.
Yeah. You know, I think before we move on to, I don't really want to switch right now to talk about Myanmar and UN General Assembly. I think we should have a couple questions about South Sudan. And so I would like you, if you muted your own phone, please unmute if you have a question. If you don't have a question, don't unmute so we can just try to keep as focused as possible. But I'd love to open up for 2 or 3 questions from those of you on the phone.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I have a question. This is Tricia in New Jersey. I was wondering if the women there that you mentioned, do they know about like what the Liberian women did? And are they, starting with something as simple as the color of the clothes you wear, that could be something they could do. Are they aware of these kind of things?
Increasingly, materials and training are getting to them.
Okay.
So those that don't are learning about the array of methods that are available.
They already wear pink shoes.
And does that give you hope?
Yeah. I think that there are both people, groups of people within South Sudan and within the diaspora who are starting to get very serious and sophisticated about their organizing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Another question?
Jonathan.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Mel. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit more so we can understand what the protection strategies are that our teams are using, and especially in the women's peacemaking teams, how they're working.
Well, first of all, good to hear you, brother. For those of you who don't know, that question was from David Hartsoe. The strategies are clearly the range of strategies that we do. We're doing accompaniment. We have advocated at the grassroots, at the Juba level, at the New York level, for the UN armed peacekeepers to do accompaniment for women on firewood patrols. And I can say a little bit of that started the day that I got to Bentiu. And supposedly they were going to be doing that 2 days a week. But the truth of the matter is they won't in any realistic way. And so that's one of the reasons why we need more people, is to do that kind of accompaniment of women especially. We're focusing on a lot of gender-based violence in terms of training with groups on prevention strategies for gender-based violence and what to do when it occurs, so it just does not continue to go on with impunity. We're working with communities in a variety of areas on early warning and early response. I've been told not to use the word mechanism. Methods. And what that entails is helping communities to put together what are the indicators that trouble's coming. And communities, for the most part, know this. They may have not organized it, but they know it. And so helping them to put it in an organized fashion and then figure out how to do proactive interventions that could prevent the violence. And if the violence has become too intense, how to do reactive kinds of activities and flee, but flee in an organized way so that the elders are included, the children are included, people with disabilities are included. They all know where they're going, food is cached, and those kinds of things, so that the early warning, early response is much more both proactive and reactive. We are starting a new project to work outside and inside of the POC areas, and the first one is in Bentiu, and that's already begun. Bentiu town is about 10 kilometers away from the protection of civilian area, and that's the area where there's 112,000 people. But the majority of people who are at risk are not in those camps. They are spread throughout the country, actually. And so we're working with women and with youth on various protection strategies so that they can keep their community safer. And we are putting a presence in Bentu town itself and moving out of the camp. And so we'll be doing more of that outside proactive presence in vulnerable areas as well.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
One more question. Okay.
Jean, can I give my question, or is that for somebody else?
We're ready.
Oh, Jean from Michigan. Hi, Mel. How are you?
This is like a reunion. It's great to have all you guys here.
My question. Well, we have 3 from Midland all together listening to you. So, my question, Mel, is if I'm understanding it right, were you saying there are 160 NP people on the ground, and you need 318 more? Is what you're thinking? And my question is, how many more people are waiting to be trained if there was the money to train them?
We're confident that we could have 318 whom we could train and deploy. And believe me, we can deploy them much more quickly than the UN has deployed this last group. But Jeannie, to deploy 312 people for a year would cost us $12 million.
Mm-hmm.
Now that makes people gulp. For example, I met with the Dutch ambassador in Juba, the Dutch have been one of our strongest supporters, and he just looked at me and I said, I'm not asking you for more money. What I'm asking all of you is to step out of the box. And if there is money to fund 4,000 armed peacekeepers, there is money somewhere to fund 318 unarmed. And so that's been our line and our advocacy line in Juba as well as in New York.
Mm-hmm. And are there lots of people who have already signed on who want to be trained? They're just waiting for that funding?
No, we don't keep a roster.
Okay.
But we do know in terms of recruiting from our former civilian protectors, both our internationals and our nationals, and also the response that we get when we put out calls, that we would be able to fill these positions.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
How about another question? I talked Marna and
That's
a
fine.
couple more.
David Newman from Winnipeg.
Boy, it's been a long time, David.
I know. What can Canada do with the support of civil society from Winnipeg and other places to help you get that $12 million funding?
I think Canada is extremely well placed to impact that because the Ministry of Defense is hosting a peacekeeping summit in Vancouver on November 14th through 16th, and at that time, at least 70 foreign ministers from around the world will be coming to talk about peacekeeping and make pledges to peacekeeping, and we need to get unarmed civilian protection into that mix. And so the people of Canada, first of all, going to their senators and their MPs with the message of make sure and include unarmed civilian protection in the peacekeeping summit. Secondly, meeting with people in the Ministry of Defense in Ottawa. And thirdly, making sure everybody remembers Prime Minister Trudeau's statement to me that he hadn't been a member of Parliament, would have been one of our peacekeepers. And so Canada is extremely well placed right now.
All I can say, Mel, is we're working at it, and you have communications which you probably haven't read yet, but the connections are being made.
Excellent.
Thank you, David. Another question?
Yes, my name's Mary from Midland, Michigan, and I'm wondering about your staff on the ground. How are they doing? What kind of impact is this increase in violence having on them? And I know you or NP takes really good care of your staff. I'm just curious what's in place for them. Thank you.
We've had to put additional security protocols in place, and we are being much more cautious in terms of how far afield people get and having larger groups to do that. In terms of the morale, I really didn't sense a drop in morale at all. In fact, we were training 15 new people when I was there, and they were eager to go, and I got to see probably 40 to 50 of our staff in the field, and for the most part, their morale is good.
Could you describe what are some of the protocols? Because I think we don't often just describe what does that mean? Like they have to be in their house earlier, they go out in large groups?
Yeah, those are two things. There are earlier curfews. For example, right now in Juba, it is 7 p.m. They have to travel in groups. They have to chart their route in advance and make sure to communicate with the people on the ground living there that we're coming. There's a lot more collaboration with the other INGOs through what's called the Protection Cluster, and that is looking at security updates on a daily basis, and then we're basing what we can do based on those reports.
Thanks.
One more question?
What other NGOs are on the ground besides the UN?
There's a lot. For example, the Red Cross is there, which isn't exactly an NGO. The MSF, Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, the International Rescue Committee,
Mercy Corps.
Mercy Corps is there, Samaritan's Purse. So there's
American Refugee Committee.
Yeah, the Minnesota-based American Refugee Committee. So there's a lot of NGOs are on the ground. We are the only ones who are doing civilian protection.
Right. That's what I was
Most of the other ones are focused almost exclusively right now on delivery of humanitarian aid because the food situation is so dire.
That's helpful. I'm Annie Scarf. I'm from the new Western Massachusetts chapter.
Oh, good. Welcome, Annie.
Annie.
Hello. Thank you.
Why don't we go ahead and just shift gears, and we'd just love to, Mel, have you just talk a little bit about Myanmar and our work there, and there's so much in the news about the Rohingya situation, and then whatever you'd like to talk about related to the UN General Assembly. But let's start with Myanmar a little bit.
As I'm sure everyone on this call has been following, there are now 412,000 refugees in Bangladesh, and the majority of those refugees are pregnant. There is another 1 million people who are stuck in the northern part of Rakhine State, which is their home state, although the government of Myanmar does not recognize their citizenship. There's an aid blockade on of all UN agencies. It's very, very hard to get anyone from the outside into that area at this point. The UN Secretary General Guterres last week clearly said this is ethnic cleansing. Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the state counselor, but really is the one who calls the shots for the party that is in power, has been surprisingly, at least externally, quiet on this. She did not come to the opening of the General Assembly last week, and she did give a talk to the nation where she condemned all human rights violations. And that would be equivalent in the U.S. if someone says Black Lives Matter, someone would respond, all lives matter. It just does not focus the attention on where the abuses are. We are working very hard to get a assessment team into Bangladesh. And we have the team identified. As soon as we can get the money together and the access, although we think that we will get access, and it would be a team of 4 people to do assessment. It would be 2 of our NP staff, 1 staff from our partner organization, and then 1 person from the Rohingya youth organization with whom we've been working. This is, again, a dire situation that it is actually much more controlled than what I just described for you in South Sudan. So we believe going in to Bangladesh and then working our way back is the best approach that we have available right now, and there are lots of protection needs among the 412,000 who the president of Bangladesh is saying, well, we can't keep them there forever. And meanwhile, Myanmar is saying, well, they can come back if they have proof of residency. So they're stuck. I don't know what else to say. This is getting to be a pretty gloomy talk for me, but it's the conditions that we're dealing with.
Any questions on our work in Myanmar? Well, finally, is there anything we'd like to talk about? I keep wondering, sitting here in the United States, what should we be focused on? How should we be engaged with the situations? We're focused primarily where we're working. That doesn't limit what's happening in the world. We haven't even,
I think that there are advocacy asks right now for members of Congress. Regarding South Sudan, they would include, first of all, keep attention on South Sudan. There are a lot of people believing there that the U.S. is going to vacate in terms of any kind of concentrated attention, and that would leave a vacuum that would fill up with more oppression. So I think the 2 things that can be asked of members of Congress specifically are that a new envoy for South Sudan be appointed, and that person be a person with expertise and not a political appointee. And second, to put pressure and perhaps sanctions on East African banks. The banks in Kenya are laundering a lot of money. And so to put pressure on the East African banks to cut off places where the kleptocrats are stashing their money. And I do want to point out, and David Newman, you heard this on Sunday in Winnipeg, that this is primarily a fight that started between two leaders for political control and for money. And it is a fight for a kleptocracy and was ethnicized. And so they were able to fan and involve old ruptures and old hatreds and old retaliations until now we've got what we've got. So those are the two advocacy actions for South Sudan. For Myanmar, it is, first of all, to provide protection for the Rohingya people and for a protective return of the Rohingya people to their homes, although many of those homes now have been burned down. And the U.S. does have an influence on the ruling party and Aung San Suu Kyi.
Thank you. Before we conclude, what other... I would like to open it up for comments or questions. If we have a few more minutes, let's take a little time.
Hi, Mel. This is David again, David Hartsow. In addition to the 410,000 people that have gone to Bangladesh, what about in the communities still back home, the people that have not fled? Is there anything or anybody that's doing anything to try to help protect them?
There's a little bit of work being done there by UNICEF and a couple local civil societies, but that's all I'm aware of. This area has been sealed very tightly. And so I don't know of anything else that's happening there in terms of outside organizations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mel?
Mel, it's Brenda Newman. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Okay, just a quick question. If you could possibly have someone send us the recording so we can forward it on to those who might help, please.
Amy is shaking her head.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes? Yeah, I should designate which way. And Brenda, I want you to know I am drinking out of the water bottle that you gave me right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
so someone else had a question.
Yeah, John Ruhr here in Vermont. Hi, Mel.
Hi, John.
So we're all extremely frustrated by the huge amounts of money that go into violent solutions to things. I mean, the Senate last week voted another $70 billion added to the military budget. And every country seems to have this huge proportion of its resources sent for troops and weapons and so forth. So where in the world have you seen, or where do you think, you mentioned Canada, but what are the countries and what are the big moneyed NGOs that have an interest in this, where we could apply pressure, that are closest to coming around to seeing unarmed civilian protection as a worthwhile thing to fund? What, in all your travels and people you talk to, is there places that are getting closer to really helping us out?
Thanks, John. You mentioned Canada. I would put Canada on the top 10 list. I would put Norway there, Sweden, of course, the Netherlands, Costa Rica, and interestingly, Kazakhstan, who are taking a very independent role right now in fashioning themselves as the Switzerland of Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
I think Uruguay is another country that has shown some interest in this. Angola has in the past, and Senegal. The last ones I mentioned don't have much money to give, but clearly the Dutch, and we are also getting money now from the United Kingdom and from the United States for South Sudan.
Government money from the U.S.?
Yes, from USAID.
Ah, wonderful. How much?
And we also just got a grant from the Australian government to do one of our regional consultations in the good practices process. So we have one of those good practices consultations set for the first week of December, and our coordinator, Ellen Fernari, is on the phone, and that will look at the work that's been done in Asia in terms of unarmed civilian protection, and then we'll have the money to schedule a second one sometime during the first quarter of 2018. And that either will be in the Middle East, North Africa region or the sub-Saharan region of Africa.
Great. So you see some hope of growth.
Yes. There are, John, it's interesting. And I hope, do we have everybody's email on this?
Yes.
That I'll send you out, or one of us will, a article that was just published in the Global Observatory that Jennifer Lowe, my intern, and I wrote on unarmed civilian protection and how it fits in to the major discourse in the UN right now, which is on sustaining peace. And so we're going to be pushing unarmed civilian protection as much as we can within that discourse, and we see it as another opening for us.
Good.
Oh, and I should say, excuse me, Gal, I forgot Switzerland. In fact, Tiffany and one of our board members, Louisa, are in Bern right now meeting with people in the foreign ministry about how they can set up more ongoing support for our work, and perhaps join with a few other countries in doing so.
Great.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and please watch for an email. Yep, please watch for an email with the article and access to the recording. We'd love to have you share it with others. If you have other feedback for us, feel free to contact me or Amy Hansen here at the office, and we'll get back to you.
And I want to just share in closing, a number of you on this phone have been with us since the beginning or since the very early times. David Grant, Jan Passion, David Hartsoe, Clarkson, Andy, and I'm sure others. And what I see right now our civilian protectors doing is they're really on the front lines, not only in very intense war areas. We haven't even talked about northern Iraq. But they're really on the front lines for all of our humanity. And if we are going to move away from this global spasming of violence, it is going to be through the active demonstration of nonviolence like our civilian protectors are doing. And they have really moved this work way beyond the vision that David and I had when we first got together in The Hague. And that's how it should be. They're continuing to be now the co-creators of not only nonviolent peace force, but how to protect civilians in violent conflict using nonviolent tactics.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody, and please stay in touch. We appreciate all you do for us. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, David.
Thank you.